That morning the air in our apartment smelled like fresh paint and cumin. My mother had woken before dawn to fry onions the way she always did when she was nervous, and the sharp sweetness of them drifted through our small kitchen and clung to the curtains. Outside the window, America looked gray and enormous. The buildings across the street were brick and serious. Nothing like the bright, crowded neighborhood we had left behind. I stood there in my new jeans, stiff and unfamiliar against my skin, and told myself that this country was an opportunity. That was the word my father used. Opportunity. He said it like a prayer every time the homesickness crept into his voice. We had moved to America when I was 18. My father's engineering contract had finally come through after years of paperwork and interviews conducted at strange hours of the night. My mother had cried quietly the week before we left, not because she didn't want a better life for us, but because better sometimes means farther. I was the oldest daughter. My younger brothers were excited about American sneakers and American fast food. I was excited about college. College had always been my lighthouse. When other girls in my old school talked about weddings and dresses, I talked about degrees and research labs. I wanted to study biology. I wanted to understand how cells could split and repair and regenerate. Maybe it was because I had always believed people could do the same. On the morning of my first day, I pressed my hair carefully, the heat hissing softly, and looked at myself in the mirror. My skin was deep and rich, like the earth after rain. My nose was my mother's, strong and unapologetic. I whispered to my reflection, "You belong there." But even as I said it, my stomach tightened. The campus was bigger than I imagined. Wide lawns stretched out like green oceans, dotted with students who moved in clusters, laughing too loudly. Their backpacks looked expensive. "Thank you in advance. And you, what would you do in this person's place?" I would love to hear your opinion, so please share it with me in the comments. I'm always curious about what you all think, and also write me where you heard this story. For more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you. With heartfelt greetings. Until next time. Their confidence looked inherited. I walked alone, clutching my class schedule so tightly the paper crumpled in my palm. In my first lecture hall, I chose a seat near the middle. Not too visible. Not too invisible. When I sat down, a girl with long blonde hair glanced at me, then at the empty seat beside her, and quietly shifted her bag onto it. The movement was small, almost graceful. But it felt like a door closing. I told myself I was imagining it. The professor began speaking about introductory biology, his voice calm and steady. I focused on every word, scribbling notes so carefully that my hand began to ache. Studying had always been my shield. When I understood the material, I felt safe. Numbers and diagrams did not look at me strangely. They did not whisper. The whispering started in my second week. It began in the cafeteria. I was standing in line, tray trembling slightly because I still wasn't used to the food. Everything smelled different, cheese heavier, sauces sweeter. Two girls behind me started giggling. I didn't think it was about me until one of them said, "I can't understand her accent. It's like she's chewing her words." My heart skipped. I had been speaking to the cashier. I had practiced my pronunciation for days, watching videos late at night, repeating vowels until my tongue felt tired. I wanted my voice to glide like theirs. "She probably just got here," the other girl replied. "Fresh off the boat." They laughed. The sound was sharp, like glass breaking. I stood very still. My ears burned. I wanted to turn around and say something clever, something that would make them regret their words. But my throat tightened. Instead, I paid for my food and walked away, my appetite dissolving before I even found a table. The comments grew more direct after that. In chemistry lab, a boy wrinkled his nose when I partnered with him. "Do you even know how to use this equipment?" he asked, tapping the microscope as if I might mistake it for a decoration. "Yes," I said quietly. "I do." He shrugged. Just don't mess it up. I didn't. I performed the experiment precisely, recording our results with careful accuracy. When we received our grades, I scored higher than he did. He avoided looking at me after that, but the hostility lingered in the air like smoke. Sometimes the bullying was subtle. A group project that met without telling me. A study session where I was forgotten in the group chat. Other times it was loud. One afternoon, as I walked across the quad, a group of boys called out, "Hey, Africa." One of them made a clicking sound with his tongue. Another laughed and said, "Say something in jungle language." My body froze. I could feel eyes turning toward us. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked entertained. No one intervened. "I'm not from Africa," I said, though I didn't owe them an explanation. My voice trembled anyway. "Whatever," one of them replied. "Same thing." I walked away before they could see the tears forming in my eyes. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I found a quiet corner in the library, slid into a chair, and let the silence swallow me. The library smelled like paper and dust, and I pressed my forehead against a textbook until my breathing steadied. At home, I pretended everything was fine. My mother would ask, "How was class today?" "Good," I'd say, forcing a smile. "Busy." My father would nod approvingly. That's how it should be. Hard work now, comfort later. Comfort later. I wondered when later would come. Nights were the hardest. The apartment walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbors arguing in English that was too fast for me to fully understand. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every insult. My mind would twist their words into heavier shapes. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong. But every morning, I woke up and went back. Because my studies were my first priority. They were my promise to myself. I spent hours in the lab, sometimes volunteering for extra research tasks just to stay longer. The hum of equipment became familiar, almost comforting. In that space, I wasn't a foreign girl. I was a student who could identify cell structures and explain chemical bonds. Midterms arrived like a storm. I buried myself in notes, highlighters bleeding neon across pages. I skipped social events. I skipped sleep. When the results came back, my name was near the top of the class list. The professor announced it without much emotion, but I felt a small spark inside me. Proof. I was capable. The spark didn't stop the bullying. If anything, it shifted. Whispers turned into accusations. She probably cheated. I heard international students get special treatment. She's trying too hard. Trying too hard. As if effort were a crime. The loneliness grew heavier than the insults. I would sit in lecture halls surrounded by hundreds of students and feel completely invisible. My phone rarely buzzed with messages that weren't from my family. I missed my old friends, the way they would squeeze my hand when I was nervous, the way they understood my jokes without explanation. One evening, after a particularly humiliating incident where a girl imitated my accent during a class presentation and the room erupted in laughter, I went to the campus bathroom and locked myself in a stall. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I pressed my hands over my mouth to muffle my sobs. "I can't do this," I whispered to myself. But even as I said it, I knew I would. That was the strange thing about me. I broke quietly, but I rebuilt stubbornly. The first time I noticed her, Emily, it was raining. The sky had opened without warning, and students were running across campus, shrieking as their clothes soaked through. I had forgotten my umbrella. I stood under the edge of a building, hugging my backpack to my chest, calculating whether I could sprint to the library without drenching my notes. "You'll get sick standing there," a voice said gently beside me. I turned. She was tall, pale, freckles scattered across her nose like soft constellations. Her blonde hair was tied in a messy bun, strands escaping in the wind. She held a wide umbrella, navy blue with tiny white dots. You can share mine, she offered. For a second, I hesitated. I wasn't used to kindness without an agenda. It's okay, I said. I don't want to trouble you. It's not trouble, she replied, smiling. The library, right? I'm heading there too. Her tone was casual, as if we were already acquaintances. Something about that loosened the tightness in my chest. We walked together under the umbrella, shoulders brushing occasionally. I could smell her shampoo, something floral and light. The rain drummed against the fabric above us, creating a small cocoon of sound. I'm Emily, she said. I told her my name. That's beautiful, she said immediately. Did I pronounce it right? No one had ever asked that before. I corrected her gently, and she repeated it until it sounded almost perfect. I felt something unfamiliar bloom inside me. Recognition. We didn't talk much that day beyond small introductions. She was majoring in sociology. She liked photography. She complained about her statistics class. Ordinary things. But when we reached the library doors, she said, if you ever want to study together, I'm usually here on Wednesdays. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was simple. The following Wednesday, I found her at a wooden table near the window, textbooks spread out around her. She looked up and grinned when she saw me, as if she had been expecting me all along. We studied quietly at first. Then she asked about my biology project. I explained, cautiously at first, then with growing enthusiasm. She listened. Truly listened. Her eyes didn't glaze over. She asked questions that showed she cared. You're really good at this, she said. Heat rose to my cheeks. I just work hard. That too, she laughed. But some people work hard and still don't get it. You get it. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that. Over the next few weeks, we began meeting regularly. Sometimes we studied. Sometimes we just talked. She told me about her older sister, who had struggled with anxiety in college. I told her about my grandmother, who used to braid my hair while telling stories about resilience. One afternoon, as we packed up our books, she hesitated. Can I ask you something? She said carefully. Okay. Those guys who yell things on the quad, do they bother you a lot? My stomach tightened. It's fine, I said automatically. She didn't look convinced. It's not fine. Her voice wasn't pitying. It was firm. I stared at the table. I'm used to it. That doesn't make it okay. Silence stretched between us. I felt exposed, like she had peeled back a layer I worked hard to hide. I just focus on my grades, I added softly. That's why I'm here. She nodded slowly. And you're amazing at that. But you shouldn't have to survive college like it's a battlefield. Her words settled deep in my chest. A few days later, something happened that shifted everything. We were leaving a lecture when the same girl who had mocked my accent bumped into me deliberately, causing my books to scatter across the floor. Oops, she said, not sounding sorry at all. Students stepped around me as if I were an obstacle. My hands shook as I knelt to gather my papers. Before I could finish, another pair of hands appeared in my line of vision, picking up my notebook. Emily. She stood up straight, holding my books against her chest. You dropped something, she said pointedly to the girl. The girl rolled her eyes. It was an accident. No, Emily replied calmly. It wasn't. The hallway grew quieter. You don't get to treat people like that, Emily continued. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It's not funny. It's not cute. It's bullying. The girl scoffed. Why do you even care? Because she's my friend, Emily said without hesitation. Friend. The word echoed in my mind. The girl muttered something under her breath and walked away. The hallway noise resumed, but something had shifted. Emily turned to me, her expression softening. You okay? I nodded, though my throat felt tight. You don't have to handle this alone, she said. That night, I cried again. But they were different tears. Over the following weeks, Emily and I started talking more openly about the bullying, not just what I experienced, but what she had witnessed. She admitted that she had seen it before but hadn't known how to step in. I used to think it wasn't my place, she said one evening as we sat on the grass, watching the sun dip behind the dorms. But silence helps the wrong people. Her words reminded me of my mother's quiet strength. Of all the times she had endured without complaint. What if we did something? Emily asked suddenly. Like what? I don't know. A group? A space where girls can talk about this stuff. About racism. About bullying. About feeling alone. The idea felt both terrifying and powerful. Do you think anyone would come? I asked. She looked at me steadily. I think more people are hurting than we realize. We spent hours planning. We spoke to a sympathetic professor in the sociology department who agreed to let us use a classroom once a week. We made simple flyers. You are not alone. A safe space for women facing bullying and discrimination. The first meeting, I almost didn't go. My nerves twisted my stomach into knots. What if no one showed up? What if the room stayed empty, fluorescent lights buzzing over two hopeful girls? When we arrived, there were already 3 girls sitting quietly at the back. One had red, puffy eyes. Another kept her hood up, gaze fixed on the floor. The third offered us a tentative smile. By the time the hour started, 8 girls were in the room. My hands trembled as I introduced myself. My voice wavered, but I didn't stop. I know what it feels like to be targeted, I said. To be laughed at. To feel like your presence is a problem. But your existence is not an inconvenience. The words felt like medicine leaving my mouth. One by one, the girls began to share. Stories of body shaming. Of racist jokes disguised as humor. Of professors who dismissed them. Of friendships that turned cold. We listened. We cried. We nodded. Emily facilitated gently, her voice calm and encouraging. She didn't dominate the space. She made room. That first meeting ran over time. No one wanted to leave. As the weeks passed, the group grew. Word spread quietly. We weren't loud activists yet. We were a circle of chairs, a box of tissues in the center, and a promise of confidentiality. But something powerful was happening. Girls who once walked with hunched shoulders began to stand a little taller. They formed study groups. They confronted microaggressions together. We drafted a letter to the administration outlining concerns about campus bullying and lack of diversity training. Not everyone was supportive. Anonymous comments appeared on social media accusing us of playing the victim. Someone tore down our flyers. Once, a boy shouted as we left a meeting, "Go cry somewhere else." We didn't stop. I found strength I didn't know I possessed. The girl who once hid in bathroom stalls was now speaking at student forums. My voice still shook sometimes, but it carried. At home, my parents noticed the change. "You seem brighter," my mother said one evening as we washed dishes together. "I found good people," I replied. She smiled knowingly. That makes all the difference. Emily and I grew closer through it all. We studied together, yes, but we also shared late-night conversations about fear and hope. She admitted she had grown up in a small town where everyone looked like her. Meeting me had challenged her in ways she hadn't expected. "You make me see things I didn't have to see before," she said once. "And you make me feel seen," I replied. There were still hard days. Bullying doesn't vanish overnight. Prejudice doesn't dissolve because a group of girls meets weekly in a classroom. But I was no longer alone. In my final year of college, our group organized a campus-wide event, Voices Unheard. We invited students to share stories anonymously, which we compiled and read aloud in a packed auditorium. The room was silent as testimonies filled the air, raw, painful, honest. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped up to the microphone and looked out at the crowd. I saw faces of every color. I saw Emily in the front row, her eyes shining with encouragement. I came to this country afraid, I began. Afraid of failing. Afraid of being different. Afraid of being too much and not enough at the same time. But I learned that my difference is not a weakness. It is a strength. My voice steadied. And if you are sitting here tonight feeling small because someone tried to shrink you, please know this, you are not the problem. Their prejudice is. Applause rose slowly, then all at once. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me permanently. The weight I had carried for so long lifted, replaced by something sturdier. Purpose. Graduation day arrived with bright sun and the smell of fresh-cut grass. My parents sat in the audience, my mother dabbing her eyes with a tissue. When my name was called, I walked across the stage with steady steps. I wasn't just the girl who had survived bullying. I was the girl who had fought back, with books, with community, with courage. After the ceremony, Emily hugged me tightly. "We did it," she whispered. "Yes," I said, smiling through tears. "We did." Even now, when I think back to that frightened girl under the edge of a building in the rain, I want to reach through time and hold her face in my hands. "You will be okay," I would tell her. Not because the world will suddenly become kind. But because you will find your voice. And when you do, you will use it not just for yourself, but for every girl who has ever been told she does not belong. And that, I have learned, is how we begin to change things. Graduation did not feel like an ending. It felt like standing on the edge of another wide, uncertain country. The morning after the ceremony, I woke up later than usual. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of my childhood bedroom, the same bedroom I had moved into when we first arrived in America. The walls were still painted a soft lavender my mother had chosen to make the apartment feel warmer. My cap and gown were folded neatly over the chair in the corner. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the low hum of traffic outside and the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Life was moving forward. It always does. But something inside me was still back in that auditorium, still feeling the echo of applause in my bones. Emily and I had promised each other that our work wouldn't stop at graduation. Voices Unheard had grown bigger than we imagined. What began as a circle of 8 trembling girls had become a recognized student organization with over 100 members by the time we left campus. We had pushed for policy changes, advocated for diversity workshops, and created mentorship pairings for first-year women who felt isolated. Still, I knew the real world would test us differently. I had been accepted into a graduate program in biomedical research at a university 2 states away. When I received the acceptance email, I had stared at the screen for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I had fought so hard just to survive undergraduate life. Was I ready to step into something even more competitive? Even more isolating? But then I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who pressed her forehead into library textbooks and swallowed her tears in bathroom stalls. She hadn't given up. I couldn't either. Emily, meanwhile, had taken a job at a nonprofit focused on educational equity in urban schools. When she told me, we were sitting in our usual coffee shop, the air thick with the smell of roasted beans and cinnamon pastries. "I want to work on systems," she said, stirring her drink absently. "The stuff that creates the bullying before it even starts. Bias. Access. Representation." I smiled at her. "You always think big." She shrugged lightly. "So do you. You just pretend you don't." We promised to call every week. We promised to visit. We promised that distance wouldn't undo what we had built. Still, the night before I left for graduate school, I cried in my mother's lap like I had when I was a child. "You've already proven you can endure," she whispered, stroking my hair. Now you must learn to thrive. Thrive. The word felt heavier than survive. Surviving had been about holding on. Thriving required expansion. Graduate school was different from undergrad in ways I hadn't anticipated. The campus was quieter, older, lined with trees that arched overhead like cathedral ceilings. The lab I joined smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Equipment hummed steadily, and the fluorescent lights cast everything in a pale glow. There were fewer students in my program, which meant fewer places to hide. On my first day, I walked into the lab meeting room and felt the old familiar tension slide into my shoulders. Out of 12 students, I was the only black woman. Again. The professor leading the lab, Dr. Matthews, was brisk but polite. "We expect excellence here," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Competition is natural. But collaboration is essential." I held on to that last sentence. The bullying in graduate school was subtler, cloaked in intellectual superiority. No one shouted "Africa" across the quad anymore. Instead, there were comments like, "Are you sure you're ready for this level of analysis?" Or, "That's an interesting perspective, very unique." Unique. Said with a tilt of the head that meant other. During a presentation in my second month, I explained a proposed research design. I had spent weeks refining it, reading late into the night until my eyes burned. When I finished, a fellow student leaned back in his chair and said, "I'm surprised you're tackling something so complex." "Why?" I asked evenly. He hesitated. "No reason. It's just ambitious." I recognize the pattern now. The soft underestimation. The doubt disguised as concern. "I've always been ambitious," I replied. A few students exchanged glances. No one laughed. No one openly mocked me. But I could feel the current under the surface. That night, I called Emily. "They don't yell at me here," I said, pacing my small studio apartment. "They just question everything I say." "They're intimidated," she said immediately. I almost laughed. "Intimidated? By me?" "Yes," she insisted. "You walk into rooms carrying history and excellence. Some people don't know what to do with that." I sank onto my couch, staring at the peeling paint near the window. "It's exhausting. Having to prove yourself twice." "I know," she said softly. "But remember, you're not alone anymore. You built something. You know how to build it again." Her faith in me felt like oxygen. So I did what I had learned to do. I found the other women. There was Ana, a Latina student in environmental science who had been mistaken for administrative staff more times than she could count. There was Priya, a brilliant statistician whose ideas were often repeated by male colleagues and credited to them instead. There was May, quiet but sharp, who struggled with professors dismissing her as too reserved. We began meeting informally at first.
Study sessions turned into conversations about microaggressions, about being talked over in meetings, about feeling like imposters in rooms filled with inherited confidence. The pattern was painfully familiar. One evening, as we sat in a campus lounge with paper cups of tea growing cold between us, Anna said, "Why does it feel like we have to earn the right to exist here?" The question hung in the air. I took a deep breath. "We don't," I said. "But we've been trained to think we do." The words surprised even me. They sounded like something older, wiser. Priya looked at me carefully. "You've done this before, haven't you? Organized something?" I hesitated, then nodded. "In undergrad. We started a group for women facing bullying and discrimination." "And?" May asked quietly. "And it changed things," I said. "Not overnight. But it changed us." They exchanged glances. "We need that here," Anna said firmly. And just like that, the seed was planted again. This time, I was less afraid. We drafted a proposal for a graduate women's advocacy network. We gathered data, anonymous testimonials, research on retention rates among minority women in STEM, statistics that were impossible to ignore. I had learned that stories move hearts, but numbers move institutions. When we presented the proposal to the department board, my hands did not tremble. "We are not asking for special treatment," I said clearly. "We are asking for equity. For mentorship programs. For clear reporting channels when bias occurs. For workshops that address implicit bias in academic settings." Some board members nodded thoughtfully. Others looked skeptical. One older professor cleared his throat. "Are you suggesting our department is discriminatory?" "I'm suggesting," I replied calmly, "that we can be better." The room fell silent. A week later, we received approval for a pilot program. It wasn't a revolution. It was a beginning. As the months passed, the network grew. We hosted panel discussions featuring women of color in academia. We paired incoming students with senior mentors. We created a confidential online forum where concerns could be voiced without fear. And something shifted again. Not perfectly. Not completely. But noticeably. The same student who once questioned my ambition began asking for my input on collaborative projects. Dr. Matthews started implementing structured speaking turns during meetings to prevent interruptions. Small changes, but real. One afternoon, as I walked across campus under a canopy of golden autumn leaves, I realized something profound. I was no longer just reacting to hostility. I was shaping environments. The depression that had once wrapped around me like a heavy coat loosened its grip. It didn't disappear entirely. Some days were still hard, especially when I was tired or overwhelmed, but it no longer defined me. I began seeing a therapist offered through the university. At first, I resisted the idea. In my family, we didn't talk much about mental health. We endured. We prayed. We kept moving. But sitting in that quiet office, describing the weight I had carried since arriving in America, I felt something else shift. "You've been in survival mode for years," the therapist said gently. "Your body doesn't know it's safe yet." Safe. The word echoed. Maybe thriving wasn't just about achievements. Maybe it was about teaching my nervous system that not every room was a battlefield. During winter break, I visited home. My brothers were taller now, their voices deeper. My mother had new lines around her eyes. My father's hair had grayed more than I remembered. At dinner one night, my father looked at me thoughtfully. "You've changed," he said. "How?" I asked. "You speak with conviction," he replied. "Like someone who knows her worth." I swallowed past the emotion rising in my throat. "I'm learning." Later, as I lay in my childhood bed, I thought about the journey from that first rainy day under Emily's umbrella to this moment. I thought about the girls in our original circle. Some had gone on to law school. Others to teaching, to social work, to art. We still had a group chat. We still shared victories and setbacks. Emily was thriving at her nonprofit. She sent me photos of workshops she facilitated in high schools, teaching girls how to advocate for themselves. In every picture, she looked purposeful. "We're multiplying," she texted me once. That's how change happens. Multiplying. Like cells dividing and regenerating. Back at graduate school, as I entered my final year of research, I faced the most challenging project yet, designing an independent study that could shape my career. The pressure was immense. Funding depended on results. Publications mattered. But this time, when doubt whispered in my ear, it didn't sound as convincing. "You don't belong here." I had heard that voice before. I had outgrown it. On the day I defended my thesis proposal, I wore a deep blue blazer my mother had mailed me, saying it matched the steadiness in my eyes. As I stood before the committee, explaining my methodology and projected outcomes, I felt calm. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear no longer controlled me. When the committee chair finally said, "We approve your proposal," I exhaled slowly, almost reverently. Afterward, I stepped outside into crisp spring air and called Emily. "I did it," I said. "I never doubted you," she replied. "I doubted me enough for both of us," I admitted, laughing softly. "Good thing I'm stubborn," she said. As I walked back toward the lab, sunlight warming my face, I realized something that would have seemed impossible years ago. The girl who was bullied for her accent, for her skin, for her difference, she had not disappeared. She had transformed. She had learned that strength is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to keep building in spite of it. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this story was still unfolding. Because somewhere, right now, there is another girl stepping onto a campus for the first time. Another girl gripping her schedule too tightly. Another girl hearing laughter that cuts like glass. And maybe, just maybe, because we dared to speak, because we dared to organize, because we refused to shrink, her path will be a little less lonely. I will keep doing this work. In labs. In lecture halls. In meeting rooms. Not just for my younger self. But for every girl who deserves to thrive, not just survive. The year I defended my thesis proposal was the year I stopped apologizing for taking up space. It didn't happen all at once. Growth rarely does. It happened in quiet, ordinary moments, when I chose not to shrink in meetings, when I held eye contact a second longer, when I let silence stretch after someone interrupted me instead of filling it with nervous laughter. My research consumed most of my days. I was studying cellular regeneration, how certain cells repair damaged tissue after trauma. The irony was not lost on me. Every time I examined a slide under the microscope, watching cells divide and reassemble, I thought about resilience. About the body's insistence on healing, even after injury. Some afternoons, the lab was so quiet I could hear my own breathing inside the mask. The faint smell of ethanol lingered in the air. The hum of refrigeration units blended into a low mechanical lullaby. It was in those moments that I felt most grounded. Science was honest. Results didn't care about bias. Data responded only to precision and patience. But the human world around science was not as neutral. As our graduate women's advocacy network gained visibility, resistance grew louder. An anonymous email circulated through the department listserv accusing us of creating division and weaponizing identity. The language was polished, careful, but sharp underneath. I stared at the screen in my apartment, my jaw tightening. For a split second, the old fear tried to return. The instinct to retreat. To become smaller, quieter, less controversial. Instead, I forwarded the email to our network group chat. Anna responded first. "They're uncomfortable." Priya followed. "Good." May sent a single message, "We continue." We drafted a measured response, reaffirming that our mission was inclusion and equity, not exclusion. We emphasized collaboration. We invited critics to attend our open forums. Only one person accepted. He was a second-year PhD student named Mark. Tall, confident, always quick to challenge ideas in seminars. He walked into our meeting with a guarded expression, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "I just want to understand," he said. And to his credit, he listened. For 2 hours, he heard stories. About being mistaken for janitorial staff, about advisors discouraging ambitious research topics, about constant scrutiny that chipped away at confidence. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. "I didn't realize how common this was," he admitted. "That's the point," I said gently. "You don't see what doesn't target you." He nodded slowly. That night, I thought about how change rarely comes from shouting alone. Sometimes it comes from sitting in uncomfortable rooms and telling the truth without flinching. Still, not everyone was willing to listen. One afternoon, after a lab meeting where I had confidently challenged a flawed interpretation of data, the same student who once questioned my ambition cornered me by the coffee machine. You don't have to be so aggressive, he said lightly, though there was nothing light in his eyes. I felt heat rise in my chest. Pointing out inconsistencies in data isn't aggression, I replied. He smirked. It's just the way you say things. The way you say things. I knew what he meant. My directness unsettled him. My refusal to soften my intelligence made him uncomfortable. I won't dilute my voice to make you comfortable, I said quietly. For a second, he looked startled. Then he laughed it off and walked away. My hands shook after he left. Confrontation still cost me energy. Strength did not mean invulnerability. That evening, I sat on my apartment floor, back against the couch, and let myself feel the exhaustion. Advocacy was heavy. Excellence was heavy. Carrying both at once required balance I was still learning. I called my mother. Are you eating well? She asked immediately. Yes, Mama, I said, smiling despite myself. She could hear something in my voice. What is it? I'm tired, I admitted. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing too much. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the faint clinking of dishes in the background. When you were little, she said slowly, you used to cry when other children took your toys. But you always went back outside the next day. Not because you liked being hurt, but because you liked playing more than you feared pain. I closed my eyes. You like this work, she continued. You like building things. Do not let small minds convince you that you are too much. Too much. That old accusation. I had spent years trying not to be too much, too loud, too ambitious, too sensitive, too black, too foreign. Now I was learning that being too much for the wrong people simply meant being enough for myself. Spring melted into summer, and with it came the final stretch of my research. Long nights blurred into early mornings. Coffee cups accumulated on my desk. I pinned encouraging notes above my workspace, quotes from women scientists, screenshots of supportive messages from our network members, a photo of Emily and me at graduation, arms thrown around each other, faces bright with victory. Emily visited once during that summer. We hadn't seen each other in months, and when she stepped off the bus, we hugged like survivors reunited after a storm. You look powerful, she said, pulling back to study me. I looked tired, I laughed. Power can look like that too. We spent the weekend wandering through campus, reminiscing about undergrad and dreaming about what came next. She told me about the girls she worked with, middle schoolers navigating identity and peer pressure. They're so young, she said, shaking her head. And already so aware of difference. Do they remind you of us? I asked. All the time. On her last night in town, we sat on a bench under string lights outside a small restaurant. The air smelled like grilled vegetables and summer rain. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met? She asked suddenly. I did. I thought about that rainy afternoon. About the umbrella. About her asking if she pronounced my name correctly. I might have finished college, I said slowly. But I would have been smaller. She nodded. You were never meant to be small. Neither were you, I wanted to say. Instead, I reached for her hand and squeezed it. When she left the next morning, I felt a familiar ache, but it wasn't loneliness. It was gratitude stretched across distance. The day of my final dissertation defense arrived wrapped in nerves and quiet determination. I wore the same deep blue blazer my mother had sent, now slightly worn at the elbows from use. As I stood outside the conference room, notes clutched in my hand, I took a slow breath. You belong here. The committee members filed in, arranging their papers, adjusting their glasses. I began my presentation. As I spoke, something remarkable happened. I wasn't thinking about how I sounded. I wasn't calculating how my tone might be perceived. I was immersed in the science. In the years of effort. In the truth of my work. Questions came, sharp, probing, detailed. I answered them steadily. When I didn't know something, I said so without shame and outlined how I would find the answer. An hour later, they asked me to step outside while they deliberated. The hallway felt eerily similar to the one where my books had once been knocked from my arms years ago. Same fluorescent hum. Same institutional smell. But I was not the same girl. When they called me back in, Dr. Matthews smiled faintly. "Congratulations, doctor," he said, speaking my name clearly. Doctor. The word landed softly, but its weight was immense. I thanked them, shaking hands, accepting their praise with measured humility. When I stepped outside the building, sunlight spilled over the steps, warm and bright. I called my parents first. My mother cried openly this time. My father's voice cracked when he said, "You have honored us." Then I called Emily. "Doctor," she answered. I laughed through tears. "Doctor." She screamed so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear. That evening, our advocacy network hosted a small celebration. Anna brought homemade empanadas. Priya baked a cake slightly lopsided but delicious. May handed me a handwritten card filled with careful, thoughtful words. "You showed us what was possible," she wrote. As I looked around the room at these women, brilliant, resilient, unapologetic, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt continuity. This work was no longer about reacting to bullying. It was about constructing spaces where young women could enter academia without bracing for impact. I accepted a postdoctoral research position at the same university, negotiating not only salary and lab resources, but institutional support for expanding our advocacy initiatives. The negotiation itself felt revolutionary. Years ago, I would have accepted whatever was offered, grateful just to be included. Now, I asked for what I needed. And I received most of it. On my first day as a postdoc, I walked through the lab with a different posture. Not hardened. Not defensive. Just steady. A new cohort of graduate students had arrived that fall. During orientation, I volunteered to speak. I stood at the front of the lecture hall, looking out at fresh faces, eager, anxious, hopeful. "I know some of you feel like you're stepping into a world that wasn't built with you in mind," I began. I did too. A few heads lifted. "But you are not guests here," I continued. "You are contributors. Innovators. Necessary." After the session, a young black girl approached me. Her hair was braided neatly, her eyes wide but determined. "Seeing you up there," she said softly. "It makes me feel like maybe I can do this." Emotion tightened my throat. "You absolutely can," I replied. As she walked away, I felt the full circle of it all. From the girl mocked for her accent to the woman whose voice filled auditoriums. From isolation to community. From survival to leadership. The world had not magically become kind. Bias still existed. Systems still required dismantling. There were days I still felt tired, still felt the weight of representation pressing against my shoulders. But now I carried that weight differently. Not as a burden. As a responsibility I chose. Late one evening, months into my postdoc, I stayed in the lab after everyone else had left. The building was quiet. The city lights outside shimmered faintly through the windows. I looked at a slide under the microscope, watching cells knit themselves back together after damage. Healing, I thought, is rarely dramatic. It is slow. Repetitive. Persistent. Just like change. I turned off the microscope and gathered my things. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt grounded in a way that younger me could never have imagined. I was still that girl. Still black. Still an immigrant. Still ambitious. But I was also something more. I was proof that bullying does not get the final word. I was proof that friendship can alter trajectories. I was proof that when women stand together, across differences, across backgrounds, they can transform not only their own lives, but the structures around them. And as I walked home beneath a sky scattered with stars, I knew this story was still expanding. Because somewhere, another girl is waiting under a storm, unsure if she belongs. And somewhere else, another umbrella is opening. The first time a student called me doctor without hesitation, I had to resist the urge to look over my shoulder. It happened in the lab late one afternoon. I was reviewing data on my computer, the faint clicking of keys filling the quiet room, when a soft knock came at the open door. "Doctor, do you have a minute?" I turned. She stood there, slim, nervous, clutching a notebook to her chest. Her braids were pulled back into a low bun, and she wore the same expression I had worn years ago, equal parts determination and doubt. "Yes," I said gently. "Come in." Her name was Alana. First-year PhD student. Brilliant undergraduate record. First in her family to pursue science at this level. "I'm not sure if I belong here," she blurted before she even sat down. The words hit me like an echo from the past. I gestured for her to take the chair across from my desk. The lab smelled faintly of bleach and paper, clean, clinical, but not unwelcoming. "Why do you feel that way?" I asked. She hesitated. "In meetings, when I speak, people don't respond. Then someone else repeats the same idea, and suddenly it's innovative. And sometimes I feel like I'm imagining it, but I don't think I am." "You're not imagining it," I thought. "You're not imagining it," I said aloud. Her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together. There are rooms that were not designed with us in mind. But that doesn't mean we don't belong in them. It means we redesign them. Her brow furrowed slightly. "How?" "First," I said, "we make sure you're not alone." I told her about the advocacy network. About Anna, Priya, May. About the anonymous emails and the policy changes and the small, steady shifts. I watched as hope flickered across her face. "I thought I just needed thicker skin," she admitted quietly. "Thicker skin is not the goal," I replied. "Healthy systems are." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. After she left, I sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight and privilege of being on the other side of the desk. I remembered the girl who once hid in a bathroom stall after her accent was mocked. If someone had told her that one day she would be mentoring others through similar storms, she might not have believed it. But here I was. The network expanded again that year. We formalized it into an official institutional program with funding allocated for workshops, mental health support, and leadership training. I learned how to navigate administrative language, how to translate lived experiences into proposals that budget committees would approve. It was a different kind of science, studying systems instead of cells. Still, resistance persisted in subtle ways. During a faculty meeting, one senior professor suggested that we were overemphasizing identity politics. I felt the old fire rise in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "We're emphasizing retention," I said. "We're emphasizing performance outcomes. Students who feel supported produce stronger research. That benefits the entire institution. Numbers. Data. They understood those." He leaned back, considering. He didn't agree completely, but he didn't argue further. I learned that change rarely requires unanimous approval. It requires persistence. Emily and I spoke every Sunday evening, no matter how busy life became. It was our ritual. She had been promoted at her nonprofit, now overseeing multiple school partnerships. She sounded tired more often, but in a satisfied way. "These girls are fierce," she told me once, laughing softly. "They're 13 and already organizing petitions." "That's because you're teaching them to," I replied. "And you're teaching the future professors who will teach them," she shot back. Our lives had grown in different directions, but the root was the same. One winter, she invited me to speak at a regional conference her organization was hosting, focused on equity in education. The audience would be a mix of teachers, administrators, and students. Standing backstage before my talk, I felt a familiar flutter of nerves. Public speaking no longer terrified me, but it still humbled me. Emily squeezed my hand. "Just tell the truth," she whispered. So I did. I spoke about immigration and isolation. About being the only Black woman in a graduate cohort. About the exhaustion of constant vigilance. But I also spoke about friendship. About collective action. About how one umbrella in the rain can alter a life. I watched faces in the audience shift, some nodding in recognition, some tightening with discomfort. Afterward, a middle-aged teacher approached me, eyes glossy. "I didn't realize how often silence harms," she said. "I've been quiet too many times." "We all have," I replied gently. "The important thing is what we do next." That night, back in Emily's apartment, we sat cross-legged on her living room floor eating takeout from cardboard containers. "Do you ever get tired of telling your story?" she asked. I thought about it. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I get more tired imagining what happens if I don't." She nodded. We had both learned that advocacy is not a phase. It is a practice. Years passed in a rhythm of research, mentorship, and policy work. I published papers. I secured grants. I built a small research team of my own, intentionally diverse, not as a token gesture, but as a reflection of excellence in many forms. When hiring decisions came across my desk, I paid attention not only to credentials, but to potential. To hunger. To resilience. Because I knew what it felt like to be underestimated. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for a summer research program, I came across an essay written by a sophomore named Kiara. She described being bullied in her predominantly white high school for her hair, for her dialect, for daring to enroll in advanced science classes. "I learned to make myself invisible," she wrote. "But invisibility doesn't cure ambition." I paused, breath catching slightly. I wrote a note recommending her strongly for the program. When she arrived that summer, she was quiet at first. Observant. Careful with her words. On her third week, during a lab discussion, she challenged an assumption in our methodology. The room went still. I waited. She held her ground. And then one of the senior researchers nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "We should account for that variable." A small moment. But I saw her spine straighten. Later, as we walked out of the building together, she said, "I almost didn't say anything." "I'm glad you did," I replied. She looked at me thoughtfully. "Did you ever feel like you had to choose between being liked and being respected?" The question felt painfully familiar. "Yes," I said. "And I chose respect. Even when it cost me comfort." She considered that, lips pressed together. "You won't always be liked," I continued. "But you can build communities where you are valued." That summer, Kiara flourished. She laughed more. She contributed boldly. When the program ended, she hugged me tightly. "I didn't know professors like you existed," she said. I swallowed emotion. "We always existed," I replied softly. "We just weren't always visible." The years layered themselves gently over my life. I moved into a larger apartment. My parents visited often, marveling at my lab, at the students who greeted me warmly in hallways. My father once stood quietly at the back of a lecture hall while I taught a guest seminar. Afterward, he hugged me and said, "You sound certain." "I am," I said. And I was. Not certain that life would be easy. Not certain that prejudice would vanish. But certain of my capacity. There were still difficult days. A grant proposal rejected after months of work. A colleague making an insensitive remark during a conference dinner. A student breaking down in my office because the weight felt unbearable. On those days, I reminded myself of something my therapist had once said: safety is learned. I had learned it slowly. Through friendship. Through advocacy. Through proving to myself, over and over, that I could endure and expand at the same time. One evening, after a long week, I found myself walking across campus just as the sun was setting. The sky bled orange and purple, colors blending without apology. Students crossed the quad in clusters, laughter drifting through the air. I watched a young black girl walking alone, shoulders slightly hunched, headphones in her ears. For a moment, I saw my younger self in her. Impulsively, I approached. "Excuse me," I said gently. She pulled off one headphone, cautious. "I'm Doctor." I introduced myself. "If you're ever looking for research opportunities or just someone to talk to, my office is in the science building." She blinked, surprised. "Oh. Thank you." I handed her a card and smiled. As I walked away, I realized something profound. I had become the visible possibility I once searched for. The rain still falls sometimes. Storms still gather in unexpected corners of life. But now, when clouds darken, I don't automatically assume I must endure them alone. I know how to build shelter. I know how to extend an umbrella. And I know that somewhere, a girl who feels different, too much, not enough, is watching. Watching to see if survival can turn into strength. Watching to see if her voice can matter. I hope she sees me. Not as perfect. Not as fearless. But as proof that bullying does not define the ending of the story. It can become the beginning of a different kind of power. And as long as I have breath, I will keep building rooms where girls do not have to shrink to survive. Rooms where they can study. Speak. Lead. Rooms where they can thrive. The older I became, the more I understood that leadership is not a loud thing. It is quiet consistency. It is showing up even when you are tired. It is answering emails from students at midnight because you remember what it felt like to sit alone in a dorm room believing no one cared. It is choosing patience when ignorance would be easier to ignore. Years into my postdoctoral work, I was offered a tenure-track faculty position at the same university. When the dean called me into his office to discuss it, I felt that old, familiar flutter in my stomach, not fear exactly, but awareness. Awareness of history. Awareness of the rooms that had not been built for women like me. "We believe you would be an asset to the department," he said, hands folded neatly on the polished wooden desk. Asset. There was a time when I would have simply nodded gratefully. Instead, I asked questions. What are the expectations for community engagement? I said. How is mentorship recognized in tenure evaluations? What institutional support exists for equity initiatives? He looked mildly surprised, but he answered. I left that office understanding something deeply: my value was not up for debate. The day my appointment became official, I called my parents again. My mother cried softly, whispering prayers of gratitude. My father was silent for a long moment before saying, "You have planted your feet in this country." That sentence stayed with me. Planted my feet. When we first moved to America, everything had felt temporary. Like we were visitors in someone else's house. Even after citizenship papers were processed and taxes were paid and years had passed, there was always that subtle feeling of being slightly outside the frame. But now, standing in a faculty office with my name printed beside the title professor, I felt rooted. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. My first semester as faculty was a blur of lectures, committee meetings, and adjusting to the weight of authority. Students looked at me differently now. Some with admiration. Some with curiosity. A few with skepticism. During my first lecture, I stood at the front of a room filled with undergraduates, some whispering, some scrolling through their phones, some staring at me with open interest. I adjusted the microphone. My name is Doctor, I began. And before we talk about science, I want to talk about questions. The room quieted slightly. In this class, you are allowed to question. You are allowed to be wrong. You are allowed to be ambitious. The only thing you are not allowed to do is silence someone else's curiosity. A few heads lifted. I saw her then. Second row from the back. Dark skin. Braided hair pulled into a high ponytail. Shoulders stiff. I recognized that posture. After class, she approached me slowly. "I've never had a professor who looked like you," she said softly. I smiled. "You do now." Her name was Samira. Freshman. Biology major. First-generation college student. "I get nervous speaking in class," she admitted. "I don't want to sound stupid." "You won't," I said gently. "And even if you stumble, that's part of learning. Intelligence isn't about perfection." She nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. I remembered how long it had taken me to believe those words. Midway through the semester, something happened that tested me in a new way. During a departmental social event, a visiting scholar made an offhand remark while discussing diversity initiatives. "I just hope standards aren't being lowered," he said casually, sipping his drink. The room shifted. I felt the comment land like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading outward. My younger self might have stayed quiet. Might have swallowed the anger for the sake of professionalism. But I was not that girl anymore. "Excellence and diversity are not opposites," I said evenly. "They strengthen each other." He gave a polite smile. "Of course. I didn't mean." "I know what you meant," I replied, not unkindly. "And I want to be clear, no one here has lowered standards for me. I have exceeded them." The silence that followed was thick, but not hostile. A few colleagues nodded subtly. Later that evening, one of the junior faculty members approached me. "Thank you for saying that," she whispered. "I didn't know how to." Leadership, I realized, often means speaking the sentence others are afraid to form. At home, life softened in ways I hadn't expected. My parents eventually moved closer to me, downsizing into a small house with a garden. My mother filled the backyard with herbs and flowers that reminded her of home. The scent of basil and soil greeted me whenever I visited. One Sunday afternoon, as we sat outside drinking tea, my mother watched me quietly. "You carry yourself differently now," she said. "How?" I asked. "You are not bracing for impact." Her observation caught me off guard. She was right. For years, my body had moved through spaces anticipating harm. Anticipating dismissal. Anticipating laughter behind my back. Now, I walked into rooms assuming neutrality at worst, and sometimes even welcome. That shift changed everything. Emily's life evolved too. She eventually started her own organization focused on mentoring young women from marginalized communities. When she invited me to serve on the advisory board, I accepted without hesitation. At one of her organization's annual gatherings, I watched her stand on stage, confident and radiant, addressing a room full of girls. "You are not a problem to be solved," she told them. "You are potential waiting to be realized." I felt tears prick my eyes. Afterward, we stood together backstage, older now, lines at the corners of our eyes that hadn't been there in college. "Do you ever think about that first rainy day?" she asked. "All the time," I said. She laughed softly. "I almost didn't offer you the umbrella. I thought you might think I was being weird." "You were," I teased gently. "But it worked." We both grew quiet. "You changed my life," I said finally. "No," she replied. "We changed each other's." That was the truth. As the years passed, the girls we mentored began to step into their own leadership roles. Samira became a research assistant in my lab, then co-authored her first paper. Kiara pursued a PhD at another university and sent me emails about her advocacy work there. The network multiplied, just as Emily had predicted. Still, there were nights when I lay awake, thinking about the cost. Advocacy is beautiful, but it is also draining. Being visible means being exposed. For every student who thanked me, there was someone who questioned my competence quietly. For every policy win, there was a subtle pushback. Sometimes, I missed the simplicity of being just a student focused only on grades. But then I would remember the bathroom stall. the laughter, the isolation. And I knew I could not unknow what I knew. One particular moment stays with me. It was during a campus-wide forum after a racially charged incident involving a student organization. Emotions ran high. Students spoke with anger and hurt. When it was my turn to address the crowd, I stepped up to the microphone and let the silence settle. I know what it feels like to walk across this campus and wonder if you are seen as fully human, I began. The room stilled. But I also know what it feels like to find community here. To build it. To demand better from an institution while still believing it can improve. I paused, scanning the audience. Accountability and hope are not enemies, I said. We can hold both. After the forum, a young white male student approached me hesitantly. I didn't understand before, he admitted. I'm trying to. That's a start, I replied. Change is rarely explosive. It is incremental. It lives in conversations, in discomfort, in repeated effort. One evening, years after I had first arrived in America, I found myself walking through the original undergraduate campus where Emily and I had met. I had been invited back as a guest speaker. The quad looked smaller than I remembered. The buildings less intimidating. I stood near the spot where those boys had once shouted at me. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. I closed my eyes and let the memory rise. Not to reopen wounds, but to honor distance traveled. If I could speak to that younger version of myself, I would not promise her that people would stop being cruel. I would tell her something more powerful. You will outgrow their imagination. You will become too vast to be contained by their smallness. And one day, you will stand in the very spaces that tried to shrink you, and you will not flinch. When I opened my eyes, students were crossing the quad, laughing, studying, living their complicated, beautiful lives. Some of them would struggle. Some would be bullied. Some would feel invisible. But more of them now had access to community. To mentorship. To language for what they were experiencing. That matters. As I left campus that evening, I felt neither triumphant nor bitter. I felt steady. The journey from depressed immigrant freshman to professor and advocate had not been a straight line. It had been messy. Tearful. Lonely at times. But it had also been rich with connection. And as long as there are girls stepping into new countries, new classrooms, new versions of themselves, girls who are mocked for their accents, their skin, their ambition, I will keep telling this story. Not because it is perfect. But because it is proof. Proof that survival can become strength. Proof that friendship can become movement. Proof that a black girl who once felt too foreign, too different, too quiet can grow into a woman whose voice reshapes institutions. And I am still growing. Still learning. Still building. Because thriving is not a destination. It is a practice. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes just before a new chapter begins. I felt it the year I was up for tenure. The campus looked the same, students rushing across walkways, coffee cups balanced in gloved hands during winter, flyers taped unevenly to bulletin boards, but everything felt heightened. Every lecture evaluated. Every publication weighed. Every committee contribution noted. Tenure is described as security. But before it is granted, it feels like exposure. My file sat somewhere in an administrative office, years of research, teaching evaluations, service records bound into a narrative about my worth. I tried not to think about it too often, but it lingered in the background of every day like a low hum. One afternoon, after a long seminar, I returned to my office and found a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten note. Thank you for creating a space where I don't have to pretend I'm less than I am. Samira. I sat down slowly. Of all the metrics that would be considered in my tenure review, none of them could quantify that sentence. And yet, it was the reason I had stayed. The process took months. External reviewers evaluated my scholarship. Senior faculty debated behind closed doors. I maintained composure outwardly, but privately I revisited old fears. What if they still don't see me? What if my advocacy is viewed as distraction instead of contribution? I had built a career on refusing to shrink. But institutions are old, and old systems sometimes resist new shapes. On the morning the final decision was scheduled, I woke before dawn. The sky outside my bedroom window was a muted gray, the kind that makes the world feel suspended. I made coffee and stood by the window, wrapping my hands around the mug. The steam rose in thin spirals. My reflection stared back at me. Older now, steadier. But still carrying traces of the girl who once doubted everything. My phone rang at 9:17 a.m. It was the department chair. "Congratulations," he said simply. The breath left my body in a rush. Tenure. The word felt solid. Earned. Not given, earned. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and let myself feel it fully. The relief. The validation. The weight lifting from my shoulders. I thought about my parents boarding a plane decades ago with hope stitched into their suitcases. I thought about Emily standing under that umbrella. I thought about the bathroom stall and the fluorescent lights and the quiet sobbing. None of it had been wasted. That evening, the department hosted a small celebration. Colleagues offered polite congratulations, glasses clinked, conversations flowed easily. But what meant the most came later. As I walked back to my office to gather my things, I found a small group of students waiting outside. Samira. Kiara, visiting from her own program. Alana. A few others whose journeys had intertwined with mine. They were holding a simple bouquet of sunflowers. "We wanted to be here," Samira said, her voice thick with emotion. "You told us we belonged. Now they've made it official that you do too." I laughed softly through tears. "I've always belonged." "Yes," Kiara said. "But now they can't pretend you don't." We stood there for a long moment, the hallway quiet except for the distant echo of footsteps. In that space, I felt something settle inside me, not triumph over those who once doubted me, but gratitude for endurance. Tenure did not change my mission. If anything, it expanded it. With greater security came greater responsibility. I pushed for institutional funding for mentorship programs across departments. I collaborated with colleagues in psychology and education to create research-backed anti-bullying frameworks for colleges nationwide. Our work began reaching beyond our campus. I traveled to other universities, speaking not only about resilience but about systemic accountability. I refused to frame bullying as an individual weakness to overcome. It was a structural issue, rooted in bias and power. After one lecture at a large conference, a young black girl approached me. She couldn't have been more than 19. "I almost transferred schools," she confessed. "But hearing you, it makes me want to stay and fight." Fight. I understood that word intimately. But I also understood something deeper now. "We fight best when we're not fighting alone," I told her. "Find your people. Build your circle. That's where strength multiplies." Years continued to unfold, not in dramatic leaps but in steady progress. Emily's organization grew into a national network. We partnered often, merging research with grassroots advocacy. We co-authored articles on the long-term psychological impact of college bullying on women of color. Sometimes, late at night after long days of work, I would sit at my desk and reread the earliest mission statement we had written as undergraduates. "You are not alone." 3 words. Still true. One evening, I received an email from someone unexpected. The girl who had once mocked my accent during that class presentation years ago. Her name appeared in my inbox like a ghost from another life. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. She wrote that she had attended a professional development workshop where my research was discussed. She recognized my name. She remembered college. "I was unkind to you," she wrote. "I don't expect forgiveness. But I want to acknowledge that I was wrong." I sat back in my chair, absorbing the words. For a moment, anger flickered, old memories resurfacing sharply. But they did not pierce the way they once would have. I typed slowly. I appreciate your acknowledgement. Growth is possible for all of us. I did not offer absolution. I did not reopen wounds. But I did not carry bitterness forward either. That, too, was growth. As I moved into my 40s, my life held a fullness I could not have imagined at 18. My parents' garden flourished each spring. Emily became godmother to my daughter, the child I once feared bringing into a world that had felt so harsh. Holding my baby girl for the first time shifted something fundamental inside me. Her skin, a deep luminous brown. Her tiny fingers curling instinctively around mine. I thought about the world she would enter. Would she be bullied? Misunderstood? Underestimated? Probably. But she would not walk alone. From the time she could speak, I told her stories, not only of struggle, but of solidarity. Of umbrellas in the rain. Of circles of chairs where women shared truth. Of laboratories where brilliance was undeniable. One night, when she was old enough to understand more than bedtime fantasies, she asked, "Mama, were you ever scared at school?" I smiled softly. "Yes," I said. "But I learned that being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you need support." She considered this seriously, as children do. "Did you have support?" she asked. "Yes," I said, thinking of Emily. Of Anna. Of Priya. Of May. Of every student who had become both mentee and mirror. And I became support for others too. She nodded, satisfied, and curled into my side. Watching her sleep later that night, I understood something with clarity. My story was never just about me. It was about lineage. About what we inherit and what we choose to transform. About how pain, when met with courage and community, can become infrastructure for someone else's safety. On the 20th anniversary of our first advocacy meeting, Emily and I returned to that original classroom. The university had renovated it, new chairs, updated lighting, but the dimensions were the same. We stood at the front, looking out at rows of seats. "Remember how scared we were?" she asked. "I thought no one would come," I admitted. And 8 girls showed up. We smiled at the memory. That evening, the room filled again, this time with dozens of students. The program had evolved, expanded, formalized. But its heartbeat was unchanged. As I addressed the group, I felt the familiar blend of gravity and hope. "You may think what you're building is small," I told them. "But small rooms can hold big revolutions." After the meeting ended and the students filtered out, I lingered alone for a moment. I closed my eyes and listened. Not for echoes of pain, but for the steady rhythm of growth. The girl who once felt invisible had not disappeared. She had become foundation. And if there is one thing I know now, it is this. Bullying can bruise. Isolation can wound. But neither can extinguish a woman who decides she will not shrink. Especially not when she finds another woman willing to stand beside her. The rain still falls in this world. Storms still gather. But so do umbrellas. And I have spent my life making sure there are more of them. There comes a point in a woman's life when she stops measuring herself against survival. She begins measuring herself against impact. I felt that shift quietly, not in applause or promotion, but one ordinary Tuesday afternoon while sitting in my office reviewing scholarship applications for incoming freshmen. My daughter's crayon drawing was taped to the corner of my bookshelf, bright, uneven strokes of brown and gold labeled "Mama at Work." She had drawn me in a white lab coat, hair full and unapologetic, standing beside what looked like a very large microscope. Underneath, she had written in careful, crooked letters, "She helps girls." I stared at that sentence longer than I meant to. Not "she studies cells." Not "she is a professor." She helps girls. Children see essence without resume. That afternoon, I walked across campus to teach my seminar on scientific ethics and equity. The air was crisp, leaves skimming across the pavement in restless circles. Students filled the lecture hall slowly, the low murmur of conversation settling as I arranged my notes. But I no longer needed notes the way I once did. My teaching had become less about delivering information and more about shaping perspective. Science does not happen in a vacuum, I began. It happens inside cultures. Inside assumptions. Inside power structures. I saw them lean in. When we talk about bias, I continued, we are not accusing individuals of villainy. We are acknowledging that systems influence outcomes. Years ago, I had struggled to articulate that without trembling. Now, my voice carried easily, grounded in lived experience and research alike. After class, a young white male student lingered. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," he admitted. "About who gets bullied in labs." I didn't realize how often I interrupt. I studied his face, earnest, uncomfortable, learning. "Awareness is the first step," I said. "What matters is what you do next." He nodded slowly. Moments like that reminded me that this work was not about division. It was about illumination. At home that evening, my daughter crawled into my lap with a book. "Mama," she asked, "were you always brave?" I laughed softly. "No. I was often scared." She frowned slightly. "But you stand in front of big rooms." "Yes," I said. "Bravery doesn't mean you aren't scared. It means you don't let fear make your decisions." She thought about that carefully, then leaned her head against my chest. I wondered how many women before me had wanted to tell their daughters the same thing but never had the platform. Never had the safety. Never had the institutional backing. That awareness humbled me. As my career matured, invitations began arriving from universities abroad. Conferences in London. Panels in Toronto. A research collaboration in South Africa. Each trip felt like both privilege and responsibility. On one trip, I visited a university where a small group of Black female students requested a private roundtable discussion. We sat in a circle in a modest conference room, sunlight spilling across the table. One of them spoke first. "Sometimes I feel like I'm carrying my entire community's expectations," she said. "If I fail, it's not just me." The others nodded. I recognized that weight intimately. "I used to feel that way too," I told them. "But here's what I've learned, you are not a symbol. You are a person. You deserve rest. You deserve mistakes. You deserve complexity." A quiet settled over the room. Another student whispered, "No one has ever said that to me before." I realized then how often high-achieving women of color are flattened into representation. Expected to be perfect. Tireless. Inspirational at all times. But we are human first. That night in my hotel room, overlooking a city glittering with unfamiliar lights, I allowed myself to feel tired without guilt. Rest is not weakness. It is maintenance. Back home, Emily and I continued building together. We launched a joint initiative connecting university mentors with high school girls in underserved communities. We called it Umbrella Collective, a quiet nod to the beginning. The first workshop brought together dozens of girls, some shy, some outspoken, all curious. We didn't start with statistics. We started with stories. I told them about my first cafeteria line in America. About the girls who laughed at my accent. About the bathroom stall. I watched their faces carefully. No one laughed. Instead, they leaned forward. "And then what happened?" one asked. "Then," I said, smiling gently, "I found someone who stood beside me. And we built something." Emily followed with her own story, about learning when to speak, when to listen, when to intervene. The girls broke into smaller groups afterward, talking openly about their own experiences. Some described bullying. Some described isolation. Some admitted they had been bystanders and didn't know how to step in. We gave them language. We gave them frameworks. But more than anything, we gave them each other. Years continued to layer quietly over my life. My daughter entered school. The first time she came home upset because a classmate had made a comment about her hair, I felt a flash of protective anger so sharp it surprised me. "What did you do?" I asked gently. "I told her I like my hair," she said, chin lifted. I smiled, though my heart ached. "Good," I said. "And if it happens again, you tell your teacher." "And you tell me." She nodded. Later that night, after she was asleep, I sat alone in the living room thinking about generational progress. I had endured in silence at first. She would not have to. Not because the world was fully healed, but because she had language and support from the beginning. One afternoon, while cleaning my office, I found the original flyer Emily and I had printed decades ago. "You are not alone." The paper was slightly yellowed now, edges curling. I held it carefully. It struck me how simple it had been. No funding. No formal backing. Just conviction. I framed it and hung it above my desk. Students often ask about it. I tell them the story. Not as a dramatic triumph, but as proof that beginnings are often small and trembling. As I approached my 50th birthday, the university organized a symposium honoring my contributions to both science and equity work. I initially resisted the idea. I do not enjoy being centered. But Emily insisted. "You have spent decades amplifying others," she said. "Let us amplify you." The auditorium filled with colleagues, students past and present, community partners. Speaker after speaker reflected on research advancements, policy reforms, mentorship impact. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and let silence settle. I did not set out to become a symbol, I began. I set out to study biology. A few chuckles rippled through the room. But life has a way of expanding our assignments. I paused. I was bullied as a freshman. I was depressed. I considered quitting more than once. But someone extended an umbrella. And then we built more. I looked out at the audience, faces of every age and background. The work was never about proving that I could survive cruelty. It was about ensuring the next girl didn't have to. The applause rose slowly, not explosive but sustained. Later, as the room emptied, I stood alone on the stage for a moment. The lights overhead were warm, not harsh. The chairs below now empty. I remembered the first lecture hall where a girl had moved her bag away from me. I remembered the quad where boys had shouted. I remembered the bathroom stall. And I felt no bitterness. Only distance. Pain does not vanish. But it transforms. I stepped off the stage and into the hallway, where Emily waited, older now, streaks of silver in her hair. "You did good," she said softly. "We did," I corrected. She smiled. We walked out into the evening together, the sky painted in soft pinks and fading gold. There will always be storms. There will always be ignorance that needs confronting. But there will also always be women willing to stand beside each other. Women willing to speak when silence is easier. Women willing to build rooms where none existed. I began this journey as a frightened immigrant freshman clutching a crumpled class schedule. I stand now as a mother, a professor, a builder of structures. Still imperfect. Still learning. Still growing. Because thriving is not a single achievement. It is a lifetime practice of refusing to shrink. And as long as there are girls walking onto campuses with hope and fear braided together inside them, I will continue to open doors. I will continue to say their names correctly. I will continue to remind them. You are not alone. And you never were. There is something sacred about longevity. Not just living long, but staying present long enough to witness the fruit of seeds you once planted with trembling hands. In my early years, I believed impact would feel explosive. Dramatic. Like a door kicked open or a system dismantled overnight. But what I have learned is this: the most meaningful change often arrives quietly. It looks like a student who no longer hesitates before raising her hand. It sounds like a young woman correcting someone who mispronounces her name. It feels like a room where difference is not a spectacle but a norm. The decades moved gently. My daughter grew into a teenager with opinions sharp and luminous. She challenged me at the dinner table. Questioned everything. Including me. "Did you ever feel angry?" she asked once while we washed dishes together, sleeves rolled up, soap bubbles sliding down our wrists. "All the time," I admitted. "What did you do with it?" I paused, rinsing a plate carefully. I decided not to let it harden me. She watched me closely. "Anger can be useful," I continued. "It can show you where injustice lives. But if you live inside anger too long, it reshapes you into someone you don't recognize." She nodded slowly. "I want to be strong," she said. "You already are," I replied. "Strength isn't loud. It's steady." At work, the institution had evolved in visible ways. Diversity was no longer whispered about as an afterthought. Bias training became standard practice. Reporting systems improved. More women of color joined faculty ranks, not as anomalies, but as colleagues. Was it perfect? No. There were still moments of subtle dismissal. Still structural inequities that required vigilance. But the difference between my first year and my 25th was undeniable. One afternoon, a newly hired black faculty member knocked on my office door. "I've read about the work you've done here," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I just wanted to say, it made my decision easier." Her words settled deep in my chest. When I first arrived, I searched hallways for someone who looked like me in authority. Now, others searched for me, and found me. That shift mattered. Emily and I aged side by side, though miles apart. Our calls grew longer, slower. Less urgent but no less meaningful. One evening, she said something that lingered. "You know," she began thoughtfully, "we started this because you were hurting." "Yes," I said softly. "And now it's bigger than both of us." I smiled. "That's how it should be." Our umbrella collective expanded internationally, creating toolkits for colleges and secondary schools. We trained facilitators in multiple states. We built digital platforms where girls from different countries could connect and share experiences. Technology made the world smaller, but it also amplified cruelty. Online bullying rose sharply in new generations. So our work adapted. I began researching digital harassment patterns, collaborating with sociologists and psychologists to understand the evolving landscape. We developed workshops on navigating online spaces with resilience and critical awareness. During one session, a high school girl raised her hand. "Sometimes the comments don't even hurt," she said. "It's just, constant. Constant." That word felt heavy. "Then it's not about individual comments," I said. "It's about erosion. And erosion can be stopped. But not by pretending it's not happening." We taught them boundary setting, documentation, collective reporting, emotional regulation, community defense. The work never ended. But neither did the growth. As retirement age approached, colleagues began asking about my plans. "Will you slow down?" one joked during a faculty meeting. I smiled. Probably not. But I did begin preparing the next generation intentionally. I mentored younger professors, sharing not only research advice but survival strategies. How to navigate politics without losing integrity. How to protect personal time. How to say no. Because one lesson took me years to learn: burnout is not noble. Sacrifice without sustainability helps no one. On my final semester before retirement, I taught one last freshman seminar. I wanted to return to the beginning. The first day of class, I stood in front of a room filled with 18-year-olds, hopeful, nervous, postured in ways that betrayed uncertainty. "I once sat where you are," I began. "New to this country. New to this campus. Unsure of my place. I told them about the laughter in the cafeteria. The group project exclusions. The rainy afternoon. I did not dramatize it. I simply told the truth. And then I told them what happened next. After class, several students lingered. One young black girl approached quietly. "I'm scared," she admitted. I recognized that tone. That fragile honesty. "It's okay to be scared," I said. "Just don't let fear make your choices for you." She nodded, eyes bright. The last day of that semester, I asked each student to write a letter to their future self, about who they hoped to become and what they refused to tolerate. When they handed them in, I felt an ache of completion. Retirement arrived not as an ending, but as a transition. The university hosted a formal ceremony. Speeches. Plaques. Applause. But what moved me most was the hallway afterward. Former students lined up to hug me. Some now doctors, lawyers, teachers, mothers. Some still figuring things out. "You changed my trajectory," one whispered. "No," I replied gently. "You walked it." On my final day in my office, I packed slowly. The framed flyer came down last. "You are not alone." I ran my fingers lightly over the glass. That message had outlived my fear. At home, retirement felt unfamiliar at first. The mornings were quieter. No lecture slides to review. No committee meetings. But purpose does not evaporate when titles do. Emily and I shifted our focus fully to the Umbrella Collective. We mentored facilitators. Wrote books. Created curricula for schools across continents. And I spent more time with my daughter, now a young woman navigating her own career. One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, brows furrowed. "I was talked over in a meeting today," she said. My heart tightened reflexively. "What did you do?" I asked calmly. "I repeated my point," she replied. "And then I said, I'd like to finish." A smile spread slowly across my face. "That's my girl." She rolled her eyes affectionately. "I learned from you." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You learned from watching," I said. "That's the most powerful way." Years later, as my hair silvered and my steps slowed slightly, I found myself once again walking across a campus, this time as a guest emeritus professor. Students passed me without recognizing my name. And that was okay. Legacy is not about constant recognition. It is about systems that function better long after you step away. I visited the Advocacy Center, now a fully funded office with staff and programming year-round. On one wall hung photographs documenting its history. There we were. Young. Nervous. Determined. Emily and I standing beside 8 folding chairs in a fluorescent-lit classroom. I stood there for a long time. A current of emotion moved through me, not nostalgia, not regret, but gratitude. A staff member approached. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. I smiled. "I was here at the beginning." Her eyes widened. "Oh," she said softly. "Thank you." No one applauded. No one made a speech. But in that quiet exchange, I felt something close. The arc from bullied freshman to institutional architect was not glamorous. It was built from small, repeated choices. Choosing to show up. Choosing to speak. Choosing to extend an umbrella instead of folding into yourself. That night, sitting on my porch as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, I reflected on the journey. If I could distill it into one truth, it would be this. Bullying tries to convince you that you are isolated. But isolation is rarely absolute. There is always someone else holding a similar hurt. When 2 women find each other in that space, and decide not just to survive, but to build, the world shifts, even if only slightly. And slight shifts, repeated over years, become structural change. I began as a girl who thought her accent made her smaller. I became a woman whose voice carried across auditoriums. I began alone in a cafeteria line. I ended surrounded by generations of women who refuse to shrink. The rain still falls in this world. But there are more umbrellas now. And somewhere, a young black girl is stepping onto a campus for the first time. Her schedule clenched in her hand. Her heart racing. She does not yet know the storms she will face. But she also does not yet know her strength. I hope she finds someone who pronounces her name carefully. I hope she finds a circle of chairs and a box of tissues and honest conversation. I hope she learns sooner than I did that she belongs. And if she ever doubts it, I hope she remembers that women before her built shelter. That we are many. That we are steady. That we are still here. And that she, too, can thrive. There is a tenderness that comes with age that no one warns you about. When I was young, I thought strength meant endurance. I thought it meant tightening your jaw and pushing through until the storm passed. But in my later years, I learned that strength also means softness. It means knowing when to rest. When to forgive. When to let the next generation carry the banner without gripping it too tightly yourself. After retirement, my days stretched differently. Mornings were slower. I woke with the sun instead of an alarm. I brewed tea instead of rushing out the door. The house held quiet in a way that once would have frightened me, but now felt earned. Yet even in quiet, purpose hummed beneath the surface. Young women still wrote to me. Emails would arrive from students I had never met, some from different countries, some from small towns where they were the only black girl in their school, some from elite universities where isolation wore a polished face. They would write. I'm struggling. I don't know if I belong. How did you keep going? I answered every one. Not with grand speeches. With honesty. I told them I cried. I told them I doubted. I told them I considered quitting more than once. I told them that resilience is not a personality trait, it is a muscle built slowly through support and repetition. Sometimes I would sit at my desk long after finishing an email, staring out the window at the garden my mother once tended. She had passed by then, leaving behind herbs that still returned each spring without instruction. Basil. Mint. Thyme. Growth does not need applause to continue. After her passing, I found one of her old letters tucked inside a cookbook. You have always been stronger than you knew, she had written years ago. Not because you never broke. But because you rebuilt. I carried that sentence like a quiet inheritance. Emily and I entered a new phase too. Our conversations became less about strategy and more about reflection. We had built what we could. Now we watched it sustain itself. One afternoon, sitting across from her at a small cafe, the same kind of place where we once studied as college girls, I said, "Do you think we did enough?" She stirred her tea slowly. "I don't think the question is whether it was enough," she replied. "I think the question is whether we were faithful to what we were given." I considered that. We had been given pain. We had turned it into infrastructure. We had been given isolation. We had turned it into community. "I think we were," I said softly. She smiled. As my daughter stepped fully into adulthood, I saw in her a confidence I did not possess at her age. Not because she had faced less difficulty, but because she had been equipped earlier. One evening, she sat beside me on the porch, the air thick with summer warmth. "I spoke up in a board meeting today," she said. I raised an eyebrow playfully. "Only one?" She laughed. It felt normal, she continued. Like I didn't have to prepare myself emotionally just to exist in the room. I swallowed. Normal. That word meant everything. "Good," I said quietly. "That's the goal." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You made it easier," she said. I shook my head gently. "I made it possible for you to make it easier. There is a difference." Years later, When my steps grew slower and my hands showed the fine lines of time, I was invited once more to speak at a university orientation. I hesitated at first. What more could I add? But when I stood at the podium, looking out at another sea of young faces, hopeful, uncertain, complex, I felt the old rhythm return. I once believed survival was the finish line, I began. I was wrong. The room quieted. Thriving is not just personal success, I continued. It is the courage to bring others with you. I spoke of friendship. Of collective voice. Of how systems change when individuals refuse to shrink. And then I said something I had only recently understood fully. Forgive yourself for the days you were quiet. For the times you didn't fight back. Growth is not linear. What matters is that you keep becoming. Afterward, a group of girls approached me. Different shades. Different backgrounds. Same hunger for reassurance. One asked, "What if I don't find my Emily?" I smiled softly. "You might not find her immediately," I said. "But you can be her." Sometimes the way to find community is to create it. Her eyes widened slightly, as if a door had opened. When I returned home that evening, I sat alone in my living room as dusk settled around the house. I thought about the long arc of my life. The airport where we first arrived in America. The cafeteria line. The lab. The umbrella. The classroom. The boardroom. The nursery where I held my daughter. Every phase connected by one steady thread. I refused to disappear. Not because I was fearless. But because somewhere inside me, even in my lowest moments, I believed I was meant for more than survival. If I close my eyes now, I can still see that young girl stepping onto campus for the first time. Her schedule wrinkled in her hand. Her heart racing in her chest. She does not know yet that she will cry in a bathroom stall. She does not know that she will be called names. She does not know that she will question her worth. But she also does not know that she will stand in front of auditoriums. That she will mentor hundreds. That she will reshape institutions. That she will raise a daughter who speaks without flinching. She does not know that one act of kindness under a rain-soaked sky will ripple across decades. If I could reach back and whisper one final thing to her, it would not be a promise of ease. It would be this. Your story does not end where their cruelty begins. It begins where your courage answers it. And courage does not have to roar. Sometimes, it is as simple as walking back into class the next day. Sometimes, it is as quiet as introducing yourself again. Sometimes, it is extending an umbrella. My life has been proof of that. Not perfect. Not painless. But purposeful. And if somewhere, right now, a black girl is standing alone on a campus far from home, wondering if she is too different, too visible, too much, I hope she feels, even faintly, the presence of those who walked before her. I hope she senses the shelter built quietly over years. I hope she knows that survival is only the first chapter. Thriving is the rest of the book. And the pages are still turning. In the later seasons of my life, I began to understand something that would have sounded impossible to my younger self. I no longer carried the story as a wound. I carried it as wisdom. There is a difference. Wounds demand attention. They ache when pressed. They shape how you move, how you brace yourself against impact. But wisdom settles into your bones differently. It doesn't flinch at memory. It studies it. Learns from it. Uses it. The first time I returned to my old freshman dormitory, decades after I had left, I was surprised by how small it looked. The hallway felt narrower. The fluorescent lights hummed the same way they always had, but the space no longer felt like a maze of survival. It felt ordinary. A resident assistant recognized my name from a plaque in the advocacy center and asked if I would speak to her floor informally. Just a small group of first-year girls, she said. Nothing formal. I agreed. We gathered in a common room with worn couches and a faint smell of microwave popcorn lingering in the air. The girls sat cross-legged on the carpet, oversized sweatshirts and hopeful eyes. I told them about the bathroom stall. I had never described it in that building before. I described the cold metal of the lock beneath my fingers. The way my breathing echoed in the small space. The weight of silence pressing against my chest. One of the girls wiped her eyes. "I've cried in that exact stall," she admitted quietly. The room stilled. And I realized something that tightened my throat. The architecture of hurt repeats, but so does the architecture of healing. "What changed for you?" another girl asked. "I stopped trying to endure alone," I said. And I stopped measuring my worth by their comfort. That sentence had taken me years to form. After the gathering, as the girls drifted back to their rooms, one stayed behind. She was tall, dark-skinned, braids pulled into a low bun. Her accent told me she had arrived in America recently. "I thought maybe I was just being sensitive," she said. "No," I replied gently. "You're being observant. There is a difference between oversensitivity and awareness of harm." I gave her my email address. And as I walked out of that dormitory into the cool evening air, I felt something close to closure, not because the past had vanished, but because it no longer had power over me. Years continued to soften the sharp edges of memory. Emily and I eventually wrote a memoir together, not about bullying alone, but about partnership. About what it means for women from different backgrounds to build something without centering ego. We were honest about our missteps. There were moments early on when she spoke over me unintentionally in meetings, driven by urgency. Moments when I hesitated to correct her, afraid to appear ungrateful. We wrote about those too. Growth is not just standing up to enemies. It is learning to navigate friendship with integrity. When the book was released, we traveled for a handful of discussions. Nothing extravagant. Community centers. University libraries. A church basement once. At one event, an older black woman approached me after the talk. "I didn't have what you have when I was young," she said, gripping my hand tightly. "But seeing you now, it feels like something healed backward." Healed backward. That phrase stayed with me. Our progress does not only move forward. It reaches behind us too. It reframes what once felt isolated as part of a larger continuum. As my body aged, knees aching slightly on cold mornings, eyesight requiring brighter lamps, I began to think more intentionally about legacy. Not awards. Not titles. But documentation. I organized decades of notes, research, workshop outlines, letters from students. I donated archives to the university, ensuring future scholars could trace the evolution of equity work beyond surface narratives. Because I did not want the story simplified into something neat and inspirational. It was messy. There were funding rejections. Faculty resistance. Anonymous complaints. Burnout periods when I questioned whether I was pouring into a system that would never fully change. There were nights I lay awake replaying confrontations. There were seasons I pulled back to protect my mental health. The story was not a straight line upward. It was layered. Human. One winter evening, sitting beside the fireplace with my daughter, now a mother herself, I watched my granddaughter toddle across the living room floor. Her laughter was bright and uninhibited. She reached for my hands, small fingers wrapping around mine. "Grandma," she babbled. The word startled me. Grandma. I had once been the girl in the cafeteria. Now I was the elder in the room. My daughter caught my expression. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded, eyes warm. "I just didn't know if I'd get here," I admitted. She squeezed my shoulder. "But you did." Later that night, after they had gone home, I sat alone again with memory. I realized something profound. The girls who bullied me likely carried their own insecurities. Their own unexamined biases handed down without interrogation. I no longer felt anger toward them. Not because what they did was acceptable, but because my life had expanded beyond the scale of their smallness. Forgiveness, I learned, is not about absolving harm. It is about releasing yourself from carrying it indefinitely. In my final public talk, given at a national conference on educational equity, I chose to close with something simple. I was bullied, I said plainly. I was depressed. I felt alone. No dramatic pause. Just truth. And I am still here. The audience was silent. Not because I was extraordinary, I continued. But because I found community. Because one person chose empathy over indifference. And because I chose not to disappear. I scanned the crowd, faces young and old, different races, different professions. You do not need to be perfect to create change. You need to be consistent. You need to be willing to learn. And you need to refuse the lie that someone else's discomfort defines your value. When the applause came, it felt less like celebration and more like affirmation. After that conference, I declined most speaking invitations. It was time to live quietly. To garden. To read novels that had nothing to do with research. To take long walks without rehearsing arguments in my head. But even in quiet, the mission never fully left me. I corrected strangers gently when they mispronounced names. I supported scholarships anonymously. I listened when young women in my neighborhood shared their workplace frustrations. Advocacy does not always require a stage. Sometimes it requires a kitchen table. Now, in the stillness of late evening, when the world settles and memory rises like mist, I hold my life with both hands. I see the frightened immigrant freshman. I see the grieving daughter. I see the determined professor. I see the friend under the umbrella. I see the mother teaching her child to speak clearly. I see the grandmother watching a new generation move without flinching. And I understand something fully at last. Thriving was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself true. True to my voice. True to my intellect. True to my boundaries. True to my softness. If there is one final truth I carry, it is this. Bullying is an attempt to shrink someone. But when a girl refuses to shrink, and instead grows roots deep enough to anchor others, she transforms more than her own life. She transforms the landscape. I was once a girl who hid in a bathroom stall. I became a woman who built rooms where no one had to hide. And somewhere, tonight, another young black girl is stepping into a lecture hall, feeling the familiar flutter of uncertainty. She does not know my name. She does not need to. What she needs is space. What she needs is possibility. What she needs is the quiet assurance that her presence is not a question mark. It is a declaration. And whether she realizes it yet or not, she, too, is capable of building umbrellas. She, too, can turn hurt into architecture. She, too, can choose to stay. And staying, steadily, courageously, together, is how we change the world. Even now, as I sit on my porch with the sun sliding low behind the trees, I realize that the story is never truly finished. The air smells faintly of lilacs from the garden Emily planted years ago, and the quiet hum of cicadas drifts from the nearby woods. It's the kind of evening that reminds you. Life moves slowly, in layers, in moments that feel ordinary until you notice the weight they carry. A text buzzes on my phone. It's from a young woman I mentored last year. She has just been accepted to a graduate program I had recommended. She writes, "I still remember sitting in your office, feeling like I didn't belong. Thank you for showing me that I do." I put the phone down for a moment and let the words sink in. It is a strange, wonderful thing, to be witness to someone else stepping into the life you helped open. And yet, the more I reflect, the more I understand, this chain of mentorship is endless. One hand reaches back, another reaches forward. One umbrella opens, another unfolds beside it. Later, my daughter joins me on the porch with a cup of tea. She carries the same quiet confidence that has been my pride since she was little, the kind of presence that commands attention without demanding it. She sits beside me, her shoulder brushing mine, and we watch the golden light settle over the trees. I had a meeting today, she says casually. I corrected a colleague who misrepresented my research. It felt good. I smile, remembering my own first confrontation decades ago, the one that felt like an impossible climb. Good, I say simply. Never stop correcting the record. Never let anyone define your worth for you. She laughs softly, a sound I know will stay with me long after this moment. I hope I can do as much as you did someday. You already have, I reply, placing a hand over hers. Every time you speak up, every time you make space for someone else, you are carrying this forward. There is a rustling at the edge of the garden. A new neighbor, young, ambitious, and full of questions about the campus, waves as she passes. My daughter waves back, confidently. I realize that this is the rhythm of life. One generation walking beside the next, passing lessons without fanfare, opening doors quietly, leaving umbrellas where they are most needed. The rain comes that night, soft at first, then steady. I step onto the porch with a small umbrella, holding it over the flower beds. The droplets tap gently against the canvas, a familiar, comforting sound. I think of the first umbrella Emily held over me on that rainy day so many years ago, and I understand fully, the rain itself is not the enemy. It is the way we shelter ourselves and others that shapes the world. I watch the water beat on leaves, feel the wind lift strands of my hair, and I know this story, the story that began with fear, with isolation, with doubt, is still alive. It lives in me. In my daughter. In the students who find courage because someone once stood beside them. It is a living, breathing testament to resilience, to love, to persistence. And I realize, at the very edge of nightfall, that there is still more work. Not because the world has become cruel again, but because growth is infinite. Because mentoring, protection, and community building are never finished. Because every young woman who steps into a new space deserves the chance to feel seen, to feel safe, to feel like she belongs. I close the umbrella gently and step back inside. The rain continues outside, steady and unrelenting. And I smile, because I know this, storms will always come, but we have learned how to shelter one another. And as long as we do, the story will continue, long after we have gone, carried forward by the voices, hands, and hearts of those we taught to stand tall. Because thriving is contagious. Because courage is inherited. And because every umbrella opened, no matter how small, leaves a legacy that can last generations. This is where I leave it, for now. But the next chapter? It begins the moment a new girl steps into a classroom, uncertain and trembling, and discovers that she is not alone.